Howdy, friends, and welcome back. This is The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey, Book 1, The Outlaw. So saddle up. Let's ride. So it was in him then, an inherited fighting instinct, a driving intensity to kill. He was the last of the Duanes, the old fighting stock of Texas. But not the memory of his dead father, nor the pleading of his soft-voiced mother, nor the warning of his uncle that stood before him now had brought Buck Duane so much realization of the dark, passionate strain in his blood. It was the reoccurrence, 100-fold, increased in power, of a strange emotion that for the last 3 years had arisen in him. "Yes, Cal Bain's in town full of bad whiskey and hunting for you," repeated the elder man gravely. "It's the second time," muttered Duane, as if to himself. "Son, you can't avoid a meeting. Leave town till Cal sobers up. He ain't got it in for you when he's not drinking." "What's he want from me?" demanded Duane. "To insult me again? I won't stand that twice. He's got a fever that's rampant in Texas these days, my boy. He wants gunplay. If he meets you, he'll try and kill you." Here it stirred in Duane again, that bursting gush of blood, like a wind of flame shaking all his inner being and subsiding to leave him strangely chilled. "Kill me? What for?" he asked. "Lord knows there ain't any reason, but what's that to do with most of the shooting these days? Didn't 5 cowboys over to Everall's kill one another dead all because they got to jerking it quirt among themselves? And Cal has no reason to love you. His girl was sweet on you." "I quit when I found out she was his girl." "I reckon she ain't quit, but never mind her or reasons. Cal's here, just drunk enough to be ugly. He's aching to kill somebody. He's one of them four-flush gunfighters. He'd like to be thought bad. There's a lot of wild cowboys whose ambitions for reputation. They talk about how quick they are on the draw. They ate Bland and Kingfisher and Hardin and all the big outlaws. They all make threats about joining the gangs along the Rio Grande. They laugh at the sheriffs and brag about how they'd fix all the rangers. Cal's sure not much for you to bother with if you only keep out of his way." "You mean for me to run?" asked Duane in scorn. "I reckon I wouldn't put it that way. Just avoid him. Buck, I'm not afraid of Cal. Would get you if you met down there in town. You've your father's eye and his slick hand with a gun. What I'm most afraid of is that you'll kill Bain." Duane was silent, letting his uncle's earnest words sink in, trying to realize their significance. If Texas ever recovers from that fool war and kills off these outlaws, why, a young man will have a lookout, went on the uncle. "You're 23 now and powerful sight of a fine fellow, barring your temper. You've a chance at life, but if you go gunfight and if you kill a man, you're ruined. Then you'll kill another, and it'll be the same old story, and the Rangers would make you an outlaw. The Rangers mean law and order for Texas. This even break business doesn't work with them. If you resist or arrest, they'll kill you. If you submit to arrest, then you go to jail, and then maybe you hang." "I'll never hang," muttered Duane darkly. "I reckon you wouldn't," replied the old man. "You'd be like your father. He was ever ready to draw, too ready. In times like these, with Texas Rangers enforcing the law, your dad would have driven to the river. And son, I'm afraid you're a chip off the old block. Can't you hold in, keep your temper, run away from trouble? Because it's only result in you getting the worst of it in the end. Your father was killed in a street fight, and it was told of him that he was shot twice after a bullet had passed through his heart. Think of the terrible nature of a man to be able to do that. If you have any such blood in you, never give it a chance." "What you say is all very well, Uncle," returned Duane, "but only way out for me is to run, and I won't do it. Cal Bain and his outfit have already made me look like a coward. He says I'm afraid to come out and face him. Man simply can't stand that in this country. Besides, Cal would shoot me in the back someday if I don't face him. Well, then, what are you going to do? Inquired the older man. I haven't decided yet. No, but you're coming to it mighty fast. That damn spell's working on you. You're different today. I remember how you used to be moody and lose your temper and talk wild. Never was much afraid of you then. But now you're getting cool and quiet. You think deep, and I don't like that in your eye. It reminds me of your father. I wonder what Dad would say to me today if he were alive and here, said Dwayne. What do you think? What could you expect of a man who never wore a glove on his right hand for 20 years? Well, he'd hardly have said much. Dad never talked, but he would have done a lot. And I guess I'll go downtown and let Cal Bain find me. Then followed a long silence, during which Dwayne sat with downcast eyes, and the uncle appeared lost in sad thought of future. Presently he turned to Dwayne with an expression that denoted resignation, and yet a spirit which showed wherein they were of the same blood. You've got a fast horse, the fastest I know of in this country. After you meet Bain, hurry back home. I'll have a saddlebag packed for you and a horse ready. With that, he turned on his heel and went into the house, leaving Dwayne to revolve in his mind in his singular speech. Buck wondered presently if he shared his uncle's opinion of the result of a meeting between himself and Bain. His thoughts were vague, but on the instant of final decision, when he had settled with himself that he would meet Bain, such a storm of passion assailed him that he felt he was being shaken with ague. Yet it was all internal inside his breast, for his hand was like a rock, and for all could see, not a muscle about him quivered. He had no fear of Bain, or any other man, but a vague fear of himself, of the strange force in him, which made him ponder and shake his head. It was as he had not at all to say on this matter. There appeared to have been in him reluctance to let himself go, and some voice, some spirit from the distance, something he was not accountable for, had compelled him. That hour of Dwayne's life was like years of actual living, and in it he became a thoughtful man. He went into the house and buckled on his belt and gun. The gun was a Colt .45 six-shot, heavy, with an ivory handle. He had packed it on and off for 5 years. Before that, it had been used by his father. There were a number of notches filed in the bulge of the ivory handle. This gun was the one his father had fired twice after being shot through the heart, and his hand had stiffened so tightly upon it, the death grip, that his fingers had to be pried open. It had never been drawn upon any man since. It had come into Dwayne's possession, but the cold, bright polish of the weapon showed how it had been used. Dwayne could draw it with inconceivable rapidity, and at 20 feet he could split a card pointing edgewise towards him. Dwayne wished to avoid meeting his mother. Fortunately, as he thought, she was away from home. He went out and down the path toward the gate. The air was full of fragrance of blossoms and the melody of birds. Outside in the road, a neighbor woman stood talking to a countryman in his wagon. They spoke to him, and he heard, but he did not reply. Then he began to stride down the road toward town. Wellston was a small town, but important in that unsettled part of the great state because it was a trading center of several hundred miles of the territory. The main street there were perhaps 50 buildings, some brick, some frame, mostly adobe, and 1/3 of the lot, and by far the most prosperous, were saloons. From the road, Dwayne turned into the street. It was a wide thoroughfare lined by hitching rails and saddled horses and vehicles of various kinds. Dwayne's eyes ranged down the street, taking it all in at a glance, particularly the persons moving leisurely up and down. Not a cowboy was in sight. Dwayne slackened his stride, and by the time he reached Sol White's place, which was the first saloon, he was walking slowly. Several people spoke to him and turned to look back after he had passed. He paused at the door of White's saloon, took a sharp survey of the interior, then stepped inside. The saloon was large and cool, full of men, noise, smoke. The noise ceased upon his entrance, and the silence ensuingly presently broke to the clink of Mexican silver dollars at a monte table. Sol White, who was behind the bar, straightened up when he saw Dwayne. Then, without speaking, he bent over to rinse a glass. All eyes, except those of the Mexican gamblers, were turned upon Dwayne, and these glances were keen, speculative, and questioning. These men knew Bain was looking for trouble. They probably had heard his boast, but what did Dwayne intend to do? Several of the cowboys and ranchers exchanged glances. Dwayne had been weighed by the unerring Texas instinct, by men who all packed guns. The boy was the son of his father, whereupon they greeted him and returned to their drinks and cards. Sol White stood with his big red hands out upon the bar. He was a tall, raw-boned Texan, with a long mustache waxed to sharp points. "Howdy, Buck," was his greeting to Dwayne. He spoke carelessly and averted his dark gaze for an instant. "Howdy, Saul," replied Dwayne slowly. "Say, Saul, I hear there's a gent in town looking for me. Bad." "Reckon there is, Buck," replied White. "He came in here about an hour ago. Sure he was some riled and a-roaring for gore. Told me confidential a certain party had given you a white silk scarf, and he was hell-bent on wearing it home spotted red." "Anybody with him?" queried Dwayne. "Bert and Sam, I'll call it a little cowpunch I never seen before. They always coaxing Trim to leave town, but he's looked on the flowing glass, Buck, and he's here for keeps." "Why doesn't Sheriff Oakes lock him up if he's that bad?" "Oakes went away with the Rangers. There's been another raid at Flesher's Ranch. The Kingfisher gang, likely. And so the town's sure wide open." Dwayne stalked outdoors and faced down the street. He walked the whole length of the long block, meeting many people, farmers, ranchers, clerks, merchants, Mexicans, cowboys, and women. It was a singular fact that when he turned to retrace his step, the street was almost empty. He had not returned 100 yards on his way when the street was wholly deserted. A few heads protruded from doors and around corners. That main street of Wellston saw some such situation every few days. If it was an instinct for Texans to fight, it was also instinctive for them to sense with remarkable quickness the signs of coming gunplay. Rumor could not fly so swiftly. In less than 10 minutes, everybody who'd been on the street or in the shops knew that Buck Dwayne had come forth to meet the enemy. Dwayne walked on. When he came to within 50 paces of the saloon, he swerved out into the middle of the street, stood there for a moment, and then went ahead and back to the sidewalk. He passed on his way the length of the block. Sol White was standing at the door of the saloon. "Buck, I'm tipping you off," he said, quick and low-voiced. "Cal Bain's over at Everall's. If he's a-hunting you bad, as he brags, he'll show there." Dwayne crossed the street and started down. Notwithstanding White's statement, Dwayne was warily and slow at every door. Nothing happened. And as he traversed almost the whole length of the block without seeing a person, Everall's place was on the corner. Dwayne knew himself to be cold and steady. He was conscious of strange fury that made him want to leap ahead. He seemed too long for this encounter, more than anything he had ever wanted, but vivid. Then the short door swung outward as if impelled by a vigorous hand. A bow-legged cowboy wearing woolly chaps burst out into the sidewalk. At the sight of Dwayne, he seemed to bound into the air and uttered a savage roar. Dwayne stopped in his tracks at the outer edge of the sidewalk, perhaps a dozen rods from Everall's door. If Bain was drunk, he did not show it in his movement. He swaggered forward, rapidly closing the gap. Red, sweaty, disheveled, and hatless, his face distorted and expressive of the most malignant intent, he was a wild and sinister figure. He had already killed a man, and this showed in his demeanor. His hands were extended before him, his right hand a little lower than his left. At every step he bellowed his rancor and speech, mostly in curses. Gradually he slowed his walk and then halted. A good 25 paces separated them. Won't nothing make you draw, you, he shouted fiercely. Waiting on you, Cal, replied Dwayne. Bain's right hand stiffened, then moved. Dwayne drew his gun as a boy throws a ball underhand, his draw his father had taught him. He pulled twice, his shots almost as one. Bain's big Colt boomed while it's pointed downward, and he was falling. His bullet scattered dust at gravel at Dwayne's feet. He fell loosely, without contortion. In a flash, all was reality for Dwayne. He went forward and held his gun ready for the slightest movement on the part of Bain. But Bain lay upon his back, and all that moved were his breast and eyes. How strangely the red left his face, and the distortion. The devil had showed Bain. Bain was gone. He was sober and conscious. He tried to speak, but failed. His eyes expressed something pitifully human. They changed, rolled, set blankly. Dwayne drew a deep breath, sheathed his gun. He felt calm and cool, glad the fray was over. One violent expression burst from him. The fool. When he looked up, there were men around him. Plumb center, said one. Another cowboy, who evidently had just left the gambling table, leaned down and pulled open Bain's shirt. He had the ace of spades in his hand. He laid on it, Bain's breast, and the black figure on the card covered with 2 bullet holes just over Bain's heart. Dwayne wheeled and hurried away. He heard another man say, Reckon Cal got what he deserved, but Dwayne's first gunplay, like father, like son. A thought kept repeating itself to Dwayne, and it was that he might have spared himself concern through his imagining how awful it would be to kill a man. He had no such feeling now. He had rid the community of a drunken, bragging, quarrelsome cowboy. When he came to the gate of his home and saw his uncle there with the mettlesome horse saddled and with canteen, rope, bags all in place, subtle shock pervaded his spirit. It had slipped his mind, the consequence of his act. But sight of the horse and look of his uncle recalled the fact that he must now become a fugitive. An unreasonable anger took hold of him. Damned fool, he exclaimed hotly. Meeting Bain wasn't much, Uncle Jim. He dusted my boots, that's all. And for that I've got to go on to Dodge. So you killed him then? Asked the uncle huskily. Yeah, I stood over him, watched him die. I did as I would have been done by. I knew it long ago, I saw it coming, but now we can't stop to cry over spilt blood. You gotta leave town in this part of the country. Mother, exclaimed Dwayne. She's away from home. You can't wait. I'll break it to her. What she's always feared. Suddenly, Dwayne sat down, covered his face with his hands. My God, Uncle, what have I done? His broad shoulders shook. Listen, son, and remember what I say, replied the elder man earnestly. Don't ever forget. You're not to blame. I'm glad to see you take it this way, because maybe you'll never grow hard and callous. You're not to blame. This is Texas, your father's son. These are wild times. The law, as the Rangers are laying it down now, can't change life all in a minute. Even your mother, who's a good, true woman, has had her share in making you what you are at this moment, for she was one of the pioneers, the fighting pioneers of this state. Those years of wild times before you was born developed in her instinct to fight, to save her life, her children, and that instinct has cropped out in you. It'll be many years before it dies out of the old boys born in Texas. I'm a murderer, said Dwayne, shuddering. No, son, you're not. You never will be. But you got to be an outlaw till time makes it safe for you to come home. An outlaw? I said it. If we had money and influence, we'd risk a trial, but we've neither. And I reckon the scaffold or jail's no place for Buckley Dwayne. Strike for the wild country, and wherever you go and whatever you do, be a man. Live honestly if that's possible. If it ain't, be as honest as you can. If you have to herd with outlaws, try not to become bad. They're outlaws who aren't all bad. Many who've been driven to the river by such a deal as this that you had. When you get among these men, avoid brawls, don't drink, don't gamble. I needn't tell you what to do if it comes to gunplay, as it likely will. You can't come home. When this thing is lived down, if that time ever comes, I'll get word into the unsettled country. It'll reach you someday, that's all. Remember, be a man. Goodbye. Dwayne, with blurred sight and contracting throat, gripped his uncle's hand, bade him wordless farewell. Then he leaped astride the black and rode out of town. As swiftly as was consistent with a care for his steed, Dwayne put distance of 15 or 18 miles behind him. With that, he slowed up, and the matter of riding did not require all of his faculties. He passed several ranchers and was seen by men. This didn't suit him, and he took an old trail cross country. It was a flat region with poor growth of mesquite and prickly pear cactus. Occasionally he caught a glimpse of low hills in the distance. He had hunted often in that section, and he knew where to find grass and water. When he reached his higher ground, he did not, however, halt at the first favorable camping spot, but went on and on. Once he came out upon the brow of a hill and saw a considerable stretch of country beneath him. It had the gray sameness characterizing all that he had traversed. He seemed to want to see wide spaces, to glimpse of the great wilderness lying somewhere beyond to the southwest. It was sunset when he decided to camp at a likely spot he came across. He led the horse to water and then began searching through the shallow valley for a suitable place to camp. He passed by old campsites that he well remembered. These, however, did not strike his fancy this time, and the significance of the change in him did not occur at the moment. At last he found a secluded spot under cover of thick mesquites and oaks, a goodly distance from the old trail. He took saddle and pack off the horse. He looked among his effects for a hobble, and finding that his uncle had failed to put one in, he suddenly remembered that he seldom used a hobble, and never on this horse. He cut a few feet off the end of his lasso and used that. The horse, unused to such hampering of his feet movements, had to be driven out upon the grass. Dwayne made a small fire, prepared and ate his supper. This done, ending the work of that day, he sat down and filled his pipe. Twilight had waned into dusk. A few wan stars had just begun to show and brighten above the low, continuous hum of insects. Sounded the evening carol of robins. Presently the birds ceased their singing. The quiet was more noticeable. When night set in, the place seemed all more isolated and lonely. For that, Dwayne had a sense of relief. It dawned upon him all at once that he was nervous, watchful, sleepless. The fact caused him surprise, and began to think back, take note of his late actions and their motives. The change one day had wrought amazed him. He had always been free, easy, happy, especially when out alone in the open. He became in a few short hours bound, serious, and preoccupied. The sounds that had once been sweet now meant nothing to him except a medium whereby he might the better hear the sounds of pursuit. The loneliness, the night, the wild, they had always been beautiful to him, now only conveyed a sense of safety for the present. He watched, he listened, he thought, he felt tired. Yet he had no inclination to rest. He intended to be off by dawn, heading toward the southwest. Had he a destination? It was vague as his knowledge of the great waste of mesquite and rock bordering the Rio Grande. Somewhere out there was a refuge, for he was a fugitive from justice, an outlaw. This being an outlaw then meant eternal vigilance, no home, no rest, no sleep, no content, no life worth living. He must be a lone wolf, or he must herd among men obnoxious to him. If he worked for an honest living, he still must hide his identity and take the risks of detection. If he did not work on some distant outlying ranch, how was he to live? The idea of stealing was repugnant to him. The future seemed gray and somber enough, and he was 23 years old. Why had this hard life been imposed on him? The bitter question seemed to start a strange iciness that stole along his veins. What was wrong with him? He stirred the few sticks of mesquite into the flickering blaze. He was cold, and for some reason he wanted some light. The black circle of darkness weighed down upon him, closed in around him. Suddenly he sat bolt upright and then froze in position. He heard a step. It was behind him. No, on the side. Someone was there. He forced his hand down to his gun, and the touch of cold steel was another icy shock. Then he waited, but it was silent as only a wilderness arroyo can be, with its low murmuring of wind and mesquite. He heard a step. He began to breathe again. But what was the matter with the light of this campfire, taking on strange green luster and seemed to be waving off into the outer shadows? Duane heard no steps, saw no movement, nevertheless, there was another present at the campfire vigil. Duane saw him. He lay there in the middle of the green brightness, prostrate, motionless, dying. Cal Bain, his features were wonderfully distinct, clearer than any cameo, more sharply outlined than any of those of any picture. It was a hard face, softening threshold of eternity. The red tan of sun, the coarse signs of drunkenness, the ferocity and hate so characteristic of Bain were no longer there. This face represented a different Bain, showed all that was human in him, fading as swiftly as if it blanched white. The lips wanted to speak, but had no power. The eyes held an agony of thought. They revealed what might have been possible for this man if he lived, that he saw his mistake too late. Then they rolled, set blankly, closed in death. That haunting visitation left Duane sitting there in cold sweat, a remorse gnawing at his vitals, realizing the curse that lay upon him. He divined that he would never be able to keep off that phantom. He remembered how his father had been eternally pursued by the Furies, accusing guilt. How he had never been able to forget in work or in sleep those men he had killed. The hours late when Duane's mind let him sleep. His dreams troubled him. In the morning he bestirred himself so early that in the gray gloom he had difficulty finding his horse. Day had just broken when he struck the old trail again. He rode hard all morning and halted in a shady spot to rest and graze his horse. In the afternoon he took to the trail at an easy trot. The country grew wilder. Bald, rugged mountains broke the level of mountainous horizon. About 3 in the afternoon he came to a little river which marked the boundary line of his hunting territory. The decision he made to travel upstream for a while was owning 2 facts. The river was high with quicksand bars on each side, and he felt reluctant to cross into that region where his presence alone meant that he was a marked man. The bottomlands through the river wound to the southwest were more inviting than the barrens he had traversed. The rest of that day he rode leisurely upstream. At sunset he penetrated the brakes of willow and cottonwood to spend the night. It seemed to him, in his lonely cover, he would feel easy and content, but he did not. Every feeling, every imagining he had experienced in the previous night returned somewhat more vividly and accentuated by newer ones of the same intensity and color. In this kind of travel and camping he spent 3 more days, during which he crossed a number of trails in one road where cattle, stolen cattle probably, had recently passed. Thus time exhausted his supply of food except salt, pepper, and coffee and sugar, which he had a quantity. There were deer in the breaks, but as he could not get close enough to kill them with a revolver, he had to satisfy himself with a rabbit. He knew he might as well content himself with the hard fare that surely would be his lot. Somewhere up this river was a village called Huntsville. It was distant about 100 miles from Wellston and had a reputation throughout western Texas. He had never been there. The fact was, the reputation was such that honest travelers gave the town a wide berth. Duane had considerable money for him in his possession and concluded to visit Huntsville if he could find it and buy a stock of provisions. Following day, toward evening, he happened upon a road which he believed might lead to the village. There were a good many fresh horse tracks in the sand, and these made him thoughtful. Nevertheless, he followed the road, proceeding cautiously. He had not gone very far when the sound of rapid hoofbeats caught his ears. They came from his rear. In the darkening twilight, he could see not any great distance back along the road. Hearing voices, however, warned him that these riders, whoever they were, had approached closer than he liked. To go farther down the road was not to be thought of, so he turned a little way in among the mesquites and halted, hoping to escape being seen or heard. As he was now a fugitive, it seemed every man was his enemy and pursuer. The horsemen were fast approaching. Presently they were abreast of Duane's position, so near they could hear the creak of saddles and the clink of spurs. "Sure he crossed the river below?" said one man. "Reckon you're right, Bill. He slipped us," replied another. Rangers or a posse of ranchers in pursuit of a fugitive. Knowledge gave Duane strange thrill. Certainly he could not have been hunting for him, but the feeling of their proximity gave him was identical to what it would have been when he had this particular hunted man. He held his breath. He clenched his teeth. He pressed a quieting hand upon his horse. Suddenly he became aware that these horsemen had halted. They were whispering. He could just make out a dark group closely massed. What made them halt so suspiciously? "You're wrong, Bill," said in a low but distinct voice. "The idea of hearing a hoss heave. You're what's a ranger, and you're hell-bent on killing that rustler now. I say let's go home and eat." "Well, I'll just take a look at the sand," replied the man called Bill. Duane heard the clink of spurs on the steel stirrup and the thud of boots on the ground. Followed a short silence which was broken by a sharply breathed exclamation. Duane waited for no more. They had found his trail. He spurred his horse straight into the brush. At the second crashing bound there came yells from the road and then shots. Duane heard the hiss of a bullet close to his ear as it struck a branch and made a peculiar singing sound. These shots and the proximity of that lead missile roused Duane in a quick, hot resentment which mounted into passion almost ungovernable. He must escape, yet it seemed that he did not care whether he did or not. Something grim kept urging him to halt and return the fire of these men. After running a couple 100 yards, he raised himself up over the pommel where he had bent to avoid the stinging branches. He tried to guide his horse. In the dark shadows under the mesquite's cottonwoods, it was hard to pull to it to find an open passage. However, he succeeded so well, made such little noise that gradually he drew away from his pursuers. The sound of their horses crashing through the thickets died away. Duane reined in and listened. He had distanced them. Probably they would go into camp till daylight and then follow his tracks. He started on again, walking his horse, and peered sharply at the ground so that he might take advantage of the first trail that he crossed. It seemed a long while until he came upon one. He followed it until a late hour, when, striking the willow brakes again, and hence the neighborhood of the river, he picketed his horse and lay down to rest, but he did not sleep. His mind bitterly revolved around the fate he had come upon him. He made efforts to think of other things, but in vain. Every moment he expected to chill the sense of loneliness that yet was ominous of a strange visitation. The peculiarity of imagined lights and shades of night, these things that presage the coming of Cal Bane. Doggedly, Duane fought against the insidious phantom. He kept telling himself that it was just his imagination, and that it would wear off in time. Still, in his heart, he did not believe what he hoped. But he would not give up. He would not accept the ghost of his victim as a reality. Gray dawn found him in the saddle again, headed for the river. Half an hour of riding brought him to dense chaparral willow thickets. These he threaded to come at length to the ford. He was at the gravel bottom, and therefore it was an easy crossing. Once upon the opposite shore, he reined in his horse and looked darkly back. This action marked his acknowledgment of the situation. He had voluntarily sought the refuge of the outlaws. He was beyond the pale. A bitter and passionate curse passed his lips as he spurred his horse into the brakes and on that alien shore. He rode perhaps 20 miles, not sparing his horse nor caring whether or not he left a plain trail. "Let 'em hunt me," he muttered. When the heat of the day began to be oppressive and hunger and thirst made themselves manifest, Duane began to look about him for a place to halt for the noon hours. The trail led into a road which was hard-packed and smooth from the tracks of cattle. He doubted not that he had come across one of the roads used by border raiders. He headed into it, and he'd scarcely traveled a mile when, turning a curve, he came point blank upon a single horseman riding toward him. Both riders wheeled their moment sharply and were ready to run and shoot back. Not more than 100 paces separated them. They stood for a moment watching each other. "Morning, stranger," called the man, dropping his hand from his lip. "Howdy," replied Duane shortly. They rode toward each other, closing half the gap, and then they halted again. "I see you ain't no ranger," called the rider. "And sure I ain't none." He laughed loudly as if he'd made a joke. "How do you know I wasn't a ranger?" asked Duane. Curiously, somehow he instantly divined this horseman was no officer, or even a rancher trailing stolen stock. "Well," said the fellow, starting his horse forward to walk, "ranger never get ready to run the other way from another man." He laughed again. He was small and wiry, slouchy of attire, and armed to the teeth. He bestrode a fine bay horse. He had quick, dancing brown eyes, once frank and bold, and a coarse bronze face. Evidently he was a good-natured ruffian. Duane acknowledged the truth of the assertion and turned over his mind to how shrewdly the fellow had guessed him to be a hunted man. "My name's Luke Stevenson. I hail from the river. Who are you?" said the stranger. Duane was silent. "I reckon you're Buck Duane," went on Stevens. "I heard you was a damn bad man with a gun." This time Duane laughed. Not the doubtful compliment, but the idea the first outlaw he met should know him. Here was proof of how swiftly facts about gunplay traveled on the Texas border. "Well, Buck," said Stevens in a friendly manner, "I ain't presuming on your time or company. I see you're heading for the river, but you stop long enough to stake a feller a bite of grub?" "I'm out of grub. Pretty hungry myself," admitted Duane. "Been pushing your hoss, I see. Well, I reckon you better stock up before you hit that stretch of country." He made a wide sweep of his right arm, indicating the southwest, and there was that in his action which seemed significant of vast and barren region. "Stock up?" queried Duane thoughtfully. "Sure. Feller has to get to eat. I can rustle along without whiskey, but not without grub. That's what makes it so embarrassing traveling these parts, dodging your shadow. Now I'm on my way to Mercer. It's a 2-bit little town upriver ways. I'm going to pack out some grub." Stevens' tone was inviting. Evidently he would welcome Duane's companionship, but he did not openly say so. Duane kept silent, however, and then Stevens went on. "Stranger, in this here country, two's a crowd. It's safer. I never was much on this lone wolf dodging, though I've done it a necessity. Takes a damn good man to travel alone any length of time. Why, I've been that sick I was just aching for some ranger to come along and plug me. Give me a partner any day. Now, maybe you're not the kind of feller, and I'm sure not presuming to ask, but I just declares myself sufficient." "You mean you'd like me to go with you?" asked Duane. Stephen grins. "Well, I should smile. I'd be particular proud to be braced with a man of your reputation." "See here, my good fellow, that's all nonsense," declared Duane in some haste. "Sure, I think modesty becoming to a youngster," replied Stevens. "I hate a brag, and I've no use for these four-flush cowboys. They're always looking for trouble and talking gunplay. Buck, I don't know much about you, but every man who's lived along Texas border remembers a lot about your dad. It was expected of you, I reckon, and much of your rep was established for you thronged a gun. I just heard that was lightning on the draw, and when you cut loose with a gun, why, The figure on the ace of spades would just cover your cluster of bullet holes. That's the word that's gone down the border. Kind of reputation most sure to fly far and swift ahead of a man in this country. And the safest, too, I'll gamble on that. It's the land of the draw. I see now you're only a boy, though you're sure a strapping husky one. Now, Buck, I'm not a spring chicken. I've been long on the dodge. Maybe a little of my society won't hurt you none. You'll need to learn the country. There was something sincere and likable about this outlaw. I dare say you're right, replied Duane quietly. I'll go to Mercer with you. Next moment he was riding down the road with Stevens. Duane had never been much of a talker, and now he found speech difficult. But his companion did not seem to mind that. He was a jocose, voluble fellow, probably glad now to hear the sound of his own voice. Duane listened, sometimes he thought, with a pang of distinction of name and heritage of blood his father had left to him. Later that day, a couple hours before sunset, Duane and Stevens, having rested their horses in the shade of some mesquites near the town of Mercer, saddled up and prepared to move. Buck, as we're looking for grub and not trouble, I reckon you better hang up out of here, Stevens was saying as he mounted. You see, towns and sheriffs and rangers are always looking for new fellers gone bad. They sort of forget most of the old boys, except those that are plumb bad. Now, nobody in Mercer will take notice of me. Reckon there's been 1,000 men run into the river country to become outlaws since yours truly. You just wait here and be ready to ride hard. Maybe my besetting sin will go operate in spite of my good intentions. In which case, there'll be, well, his pause was significant. He grinned. His brown eyes danced with a kind of wild humor. Stevens, you got any money? Asked Duane. Money? Exclaimed Luke blankly. Say, I haven't owned a 2-beat pence since, well, for some time. I'll furnish money for grub, returned Duane, and for whiskey, too, providing you hurry back here without making trouble. Sure, you're a downright good partner, declared Stevens, in admiration as he took the money, and I give my word, Buck, and I'm here to say I never broke that yet. Lay low and look for me back quick. With that, he spurred his horse and rode out of the mesquites toward the town. At that distance, about a quarter mile, Mercer appeared to be a cluster of low adobe houses set in a grove of cottonwoods. Pastures of alfalfa were dotted with horses and cattle. Duane saw a sheep herder driving a meager flock. Presently, Stevens rode out of sight into town. Duane waited, hoping the outlaw would make good on his word. Probably not a quarter of an hour had lapsed when Duane heard the clear reports of a Winchester rifle, the clatter of rapid hoofbeats, and yells unmistakably, the kind that mean danger for a man like Stevens. Duane mounted and rode to the edge of the mesquites. He saw a cloud of dust down the road and a bay horse running fast. Stevens apparently had not been wounded by any of the shots, for he had a steady seat in his saddle and was riding even at this moment. Struck Duane as admirable. He carried a large pack over his pommel, and he kept looking back. The shots ceased, but the yells increased. Duane saw several men running and waving their arms, and then he spurred his horse and got into a swift stride, so Stevens would not pass by him. Presently, the outlaw caught up with him. Stevens was grinning, but there was now no fun in the dancing eyes. It was a devil that danced in them. His face seemed a shade paler. Was just coming out of the store, yelled Stevens. Run plumb into a rancher who knowed me. He opened up with a rifle. Think they'll chase us? They covered several miles before there were any signs of pursuit, and when the horsemen did move into sight out of the cottonwoods, Duane and his companion steadily drew further away. No hosses in that bunch that'll worry us, called out Stevens. Duane had the same conviction. He did not look back again. He rode somewhat to the fore and was constantly aware of the rapid thudding of hoofs behind, as Stevens kept close to him. At sunset, they reached the willow breaks in the river. Duane's horse was winded and lashed with sweat and lather. It was not until the crossing that had been accomplished that Dwayne halted to rest the poor animal. Stevens was riding up the low sandy bank, and he reeled in the saddle with an exclamation of surprise. Dwayne leaped off and ran to the outlaw's side. Stevens was pale, and his face bore beads of sweat. The whole front of his shirt was soaked with blood. "You're shot," cried Dwayne. "Well, who in the hell said I wasn't? Would you mind giving me a lift on this here pack?" Dwayne lifted the heavy pack down and helped Stevens dismount. The outlaw had a bloody foam on his lips and was spitting blood. "Oh, why didn't you say so?" cried Dane. "I never thought. You seemed all right." "Well, Luke Stevens may be as gabby as an old woman, but sometimes he doesn't say anything it would give done no good to." Dwayne bade him sit down, removed his shirt, and washed the blood from his breast and back. And Stevens had been shot in the breast, fairly low down. The bullet had gone clear through him. His ride, holding himself and that heavy pack in his saddle, he felt a little bit short of marvelous. Dwayne did not see how it had been possible, and he felt no hope for the outlaw, but he plugged the wounds and bound them tightly. "Feller name was Brown," Stevens said. "Me and him fell out over a hoss I stole from him over in Huntsville. We had a shooting scrape then. Well, I was straddling my hoss back there in Mercer, and I seen Brown and seen before he seen me. Could have killed him, too, but I wasn't breaking my word to you. Kind of hoped he wouldn't spot me, but he did, and the first shot he got me here. What do you think of this hole?" "It's pretty bad," replied Dwayne. He could not look the cheerful outlaw in the eyes. "I reckon it is. Well, I had some bad wounds I lived before. Guess maybe I'll stand this one. Now, Buck, give me some place in the breaks. Leave me some grub and water in my hand, and then you clear out." "Leave you here alone?" asked Dwayne sharply. "Sure. You see I can't keep up with you. Brown and his friends will follow us across the river. Likewise, you've got to think of number one in this game." "What did you do in my case?" asked Dwayne curiously. "Well, I reckon I'd clear out and save my hide," replied Stevens. Dwayne felt inclined to doubt the outlaw's assertion. For his own part, he decided his conduct without further speech. First, he watered the horses, filled the canteens and water bag, and then tied the pack up on his own horse. That done, he lifted Stevens upon his horse, holding him in the saddle, turned into the breaks, being careful to pick out hard, grassy ground that left little signs of tracks. Just about dark, he ran across the trail that Stevens said was a good one to take into the wild country. "Reckon we better keep right on into dark till I drop," concluded Stevens with a laugh. All that night, Dwayne, gloomy and thoughtful, attentive to the wounded outlaw, walked the trail and never halted till daybreak. He was tired then and very hungry. Stevens seemed in bad shape, although he was still spirited and cheerful. Dwayne made camp. The outlaw refused the food, but asked for both whiskey and water, and then stretched out. "Buck, will you take off my boots?" he asked, with a faint smile on his pallid face. Dwayne removed them, wondering if the outlaw had thought that he did not want to die with his boots on. Stevens seemed to read his mind. "Buck, my old lady used to say that when I was born to be hanged, but I wasn't, and dying with your boots on is the next worst way to croak." "You got a chance to get over this," said Dwayne. "Sure, but I want to be correct about the boots, and say, pard, if I do go over, just you remember that I was appreciating your kindness." Then he closed his eyes and seemed to sleep. Dwayne could not find water for the horses, but there was an abundance of dew-wet grass upon which he hobbled them. After that was done, he prepared himself a much-needed meal. The sun was getting warm when he laid down to sleep, and he awoke. It was sinking in the west. Stevens was still alive, for he breathed heavily. The horses were in sight. All was quiet except the hum of insects in the brush. Dwayne listened for a while and then rose and went off for the horses. When he returned with them, he found Stevens awake, bright-eyed, cheerful as usual, and apparently stronger. "Well, Buck, I'm still with you for another good night's ride," he said. Guess about all I need now is a big pull in the bottle. Help me, will you? There, that was bully. I ain't swallowing my blood this evening. Maybe I'll bled all there was in me. Well, Dwayne got a hurried meal for himself, packed up a little outfit, and saddled the horses. Stevens kept on talking. He seemed to be in a hurry to tell Dwayne all about the country. Another night ride would put them far beyond the fear of pursuit, with striking distance of the Rio Grande and the hiding places of outlaws. When it came time for mounting the horses, Stevens says, "Reckon you can pull on my boots once more." In spite of the laugh accompanying the words, Dwayne detected a subtle change in the outlaw's spirit. On this night, travel was facilitated by the fact the trail was broad enough for 2 horses abreast, enabling Dwayne to ride while upholding Stevens in the saddle. The difficulty was most persistent was in keeping the horses in a walk. They were used to a trot, and that kind of gait would not do for Stevens. The red died out of the west. A pale afterglow prevailed for a while. Darkness set in. The broad expanse of the blue darkened and the stars brightened. After a while, Stevens ceased talking and dropped in his saddle. Dwayne kept the horses going, however, and the slow hours wore away. Dwayne thought quiet night would never break to dawn, that there was no end to the melancholy, brooding plain. But at length, a grayness blotted out the stars and mantled the level of mesquite and cactus. Dawn caught the fugitives at a green camping site on the bank of a rocky little stream. Stevens fell a dead weight into Dwayne's arms, and one look at the haggard face showed Dwayne that the outlaw had taken his last ride. He knew it, too, yet the cheerfulness prevailed. "Buck, my feet are orful tired packing them heavy boots," he said, and seemingly immensely relieved when Dwayne removed them. This matter of outlaw boots was strange, Dwayne thought. He made Stevens as comfortable as possible, then attended to his needs, and the outlaw took up a thread of conversation where he'd left off the night before. "This trail splits up a ways from here, and every branch of it leads to a hole where you'll find men, a few maybe like yourself, some like me, and gangs of no-good hoss thieves, rustlers, and such. It's easy living, but I reckon, though, that you'll not find it easy. You'll never mix in. You'll be a lone wolf. I seen that right off. If a man can stand the loneliness, and if he's quick on the draw, maybe lone wolfing's best. Sure, I don't know. But these fellers in here will be suspicious of a man who goes it alone. If they get a chance, they'll kill you." Stevens asked for water several times. He forgotten or did not want the whiskey. His voice grew perceptibly weaker. "Be quiet," said Dwayne. "Talking uses up your strength." "I'll talk till I'm done," he replied doggedly. "See here, pard, you can gamble on what I'm telling you, and if it's useful from this camp, well, you'll meet men right along, and none of them will be honest men. All the same, some are better than others. I've lived along the river for 12 years. There's been 3 big gangs of outlaws. Kingfisher, you know him, I reckon, for he's half the time living among respectable folks. King is a pretty good feller. It'll do good to tie up with him and his gang. There's Cheseldine, who hangs out in the rim rock way up the river. He's an outlaw chief. I never seen him, though I stayed once right in his camp. Late years, he's got rich and keeps back pretty well hid. But Bland, I know Bland for years, and I haven't any use for him. Bland has the biggest gang. You ain't likely to miss striking his place sometime or another. He's got a regular town, I might say. Sure, there's some gambling and gunfighting going on at Bland's camp all the time. Bland has killed about 20 men, and that's not counting greasers." Here, Stevens took another drink and then rested for a while. "You ain't likely to get on with Bland," he resumed. "Presently, you're too strapping, big, and good-looking to please the chief, for he's got women in his camp. They'd be jealous of your possibilities with a gun. Sure, I reckon he'd be careful, though. Bland's no fool, and he loves his hide. I reckon any of the other gangs would be better for you if you ain't going it alone." Apparently, that exhausted the fund of information advice from Stevens had been eager to impart. He lapsed into silence and lay with closed eyes. Meanwhile, the sun rose warm, the breeze waved the mesquites, the birds came down to splash in the shallow stream. Dwayne dozed in a comfortable seat. By and by, something roused him. Stevens was once more talking, but with a changed tone. "Feller's name was Brown," he rambled. "We fell out over a horse I stole from him in Huntsville. He stole it in a fuss. Brown's one of them sneaks, afraid of the open. He steals and pretends to be honest. Say, Buck, maybe you'll meet Brown some day. You and me and pards now." "I'll remember if I ever meet him," said Dwayne. That seems to satisfy the outlaw. Presently he tried to lift his head, but he had no strength. A strange shade was creeping across the bronzed, rough face. "My feet are pretty heavy. Sure you got my boots off?" Dwayne held them up, but was not certain that Stevens could see him. The outlaw closed his eyes again and muttered incoherently. Then he fell asleep. Dwayne believed that sleep was final. The day passed, with Dwayne watching and waiting. Toward sundown, Stevens awoke and his eyes seemed clear. Dwayne went to get some fresh water, thinking his comrade would surely want some. When he returned, Stevens made no sign that he wanted anything. There was something bright about him, and suddenly Dwayne realized what it meant. "Pard, you stuck to me," the outlaw whispered. Dwayne caught a hint of gladness in his voice. He traced a faint surprise in the haggard face. Stevens seemed like a little child. To Dwayne, the moment was sad, elemental, big, with a burden of mystery he could not understand. Dwayne buried him in a shallow arroyo and heaped up a pile of stones to mark the grave. That done, he saddled his comrade's horse, hung the weapons over the pommel, and mounting his own steed, he rode down the trail in the gathering twilight.